Ashford, Virginia in 1882 was the kind of town that didn't appear on most maps. Travelers passed through the rolling Appalachian hills without knowing that, in one narrow valley nestled between two ridges of blackened rock and pine, a settlement clung to existence. It wasn't a place of beauty or grandeur, though the land around it carried a natural majesty. Instead, Ashford was a town built of necessity and desperation, a place erected not by visionaries, but by men who dug into the earth until their hands were raw and their lungs burned with soot. For nearly 20 years, the Ashford coal mines had swallowed fathers, brothers, and sons, and the town itself thrived on the labor extracted from those dark tunnels. At the center of it all stood Silas Ashford, a name that carried weight like iron. He was not the sort of man who inspired affection, though people spoke his name carefully in public. Tall, thin, with a permanent air of calculation in his narrow eyes, Silas was both landowner and overseer, inheriting the mining rights from his father who had claimed the valley after the Civil War. Rumors clung to him like coal dust, that he had cheated widows of their land deeds, that he paid his workers not in money but in paper chits, redeemable only at the Ashford Company store, that he kept a private ledger of debts, designed to ensure no man in town could ever walk away free. In Ashford, poverty was not an accident, it was arranged. Still, men came. The promise of steady work and a roof above their heads was enough to draw Irish immigrants fresh off ships, Welshmen who had mined back in their homeland, freedmen looking for a place to earn something better than sharecrop wages, and Appalachian mountain families who had nothing but their hands to offer. To them, Ashford's mines were not opportunity but survival. A man who descended into the earth for 12 hours could at least be sure his wife and children would eat at night, even if the bread was stale and the meat stringy. The town itself was a strange construction. Dozens of identical cabins lined two dirt streets, each one provided by Ashford himself and deducted in rent from a miner's wages. The cabins leaned slightly, as if exhausted from holding up entire families within their walls. At the center stood the company store, a long wooden building with narrow windows where women queued every Friday to collect flour, kerosene, and cloth, their arms full of tokens rather than coins. Across from it was the saloon, dim and smoky, where men spent evenings dulling their aches with whiskey too weak to forget their troubles. The only building not sagging under the weight of dust was Ashford's mansion, a wide white structure on the hill, its columns painted bright as bone. From there, Silas could look down on the entire town, the way a farmer watches over livestock. October of that year had been strangely warm, the air heavy with humidity that clung to shirts and made the forest seem restless. Families worried about the mine. There had been cave-ins before, accidents that swallowed men whole or left them coughing blood until death. But something about the ground itself seemed uneasy now, as if the soil shifted underfoot. Old men claimed the mine was being dug too deep, that the veins of coal stretched into caverns not meant to be opened. Wives whispered to one another about faint rumbles heard at night, like distant storms with no lightning in the sky. On the morning of October 18th, 1882, the day began like any other in Ashford. At dawn, women lit fires in their stoves, children ran barefoot across the dirt road, and men prepared for another shift below the earth. The miners gathered in silence outside the shaft entrance, their lamps fastened to their caps, their lunch pails in hand. They were men hardened by routine, their faces blackened and lined with exhaustion. Among them were brothers who worked side by side, fathers leading sons into the pit for the first time, and men who had lost too much already but had no choice but to return. The foreman gave the signal, and the men filed down into the shaft, one after another, their footsteps echoing in the dark. Wives stood nearby, children clinging to skirts, offering a wave, a whispered prayer, or a kiss on the cheek. It was a ritual that carried the weight of uncertainty. Every descent might be a final farewell, though no one dared say it aloud. As the day wore on, Ashford was cloaked in the stillness of routine. Women carried water, washed clothes in the stream, and gathered at the store to gossip. Children played marbles or ran along the edge of the forest, though none dared stray too close to the mine's mouth, which yawned like a black wound in the hillside. It wasn't until midday that something felt wrong. A sound rolled beneath the earth, deep and low, a rumble that made window panes shiver. Some thought it thunder, others a wagon passing over loose stone. But when they looked to the sky, the air was clear. The sound came again, hours later. This time it was unmistakable, a hollow cracking that reverberated through the ground. The women closest to the mine swore they felt the earth tremble beneath their shoes. Chickens startled and scattered. Dogs barked and refused to approach the mine's entrance. By dusk, unease had spread through the town like a fever. Families began to gather near the shaft, waiting for the men to emerge. Lanterns flickered in the growing dark, mothers clutching infants, children standing silently with wide eyes. The foreman appeared first, his face pale, his body trembling as if from illness. He stumbled from the mouth of the mine, his hands covered in dirt, his eyes avoiding the families who rushed toward him. Someone shouted, "Where are the men?" Another asked if there had been an accident. The foreman shook his head, stammering words that froze the blood of everyone present. "They're gone." The tunnels collapsed. A roar of voices rose instantly, screams, shouts, desperate pleas. Wives threw themselves toward the shaft, only to be held back by neighbors. Children cried for fathers who had not returned. The foreman muttered again, louder this time, his voice breaking, "There is no rescue. It's done." The words struck the crowd like a blow. No rescue. It was a death sentence, spoken aloud before dozens of grieving family, yet some refused to believe it. A woman named Mary Donnelly fell to her knees, clawing at the dirt with her bare hands, shrieking that she could still hear her husband's voice calling from within. Others pressed their ears to the earth, swearing they caught faint sounds, tapping, distant shouts, the unmistakable rhythm of men trapped but alive. But Silas Ashford arrived soon after, his carriage drawn by 2 black horses, his face set in cold authority. He dismounted, surveyed the scene with an expression that held no sorrow, only calculation. He ordered the shaft to be sealed, claiming the air inside was poisoned with gas, that sending more men would only lead to more death. His words were met with outrage, but his men carried rifles, and no one dared cross him directly. The families wept and begged, but Ashford's command was law in Ashford, Virginia. By nightfall, wooden barricades were placed over the shaft, as though to erase the very possibility of rescue. The town lay in stunned silence, broken only by sobs and whispered prayers. Lantern light flickered against the barricade, casting long shadows across the dirt. Mothers held children close, trying to soothe them, while secretly fearing the truth of what had happened. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the valley had witnessed something unspeakable. That night, few in Ashford slept. Those who lived closest to the mine swore they heard it again, the tapping, faint but deliberate, like the sound of hammers striking from deep underground. Others claimed to hear muffled cries carried up through the soil, and for every ear that pressed to the ground, for every heart that still hoped, there was the bitter knowledge that no rescue would come. Silas Ashford had spoken, and in his voice lay the fate of 63 men, who had descended into the earth that morning, and had never returned. The mine had closed its mouth, and the town of Ashford would never be the same again. The night after the collapse was long, heavy, and unrelenting. Ashford was a place that usually grew quiet after dusk, the only sounds being the occasional fiddle tune, drifting from the saloon, or the barking of hounds along the ridge. But on October 18th, silence was pierced by cries that carried from one cabin to another. Mothers rocked their children with trembling hands, wives prayed aloud at their kitchen tables, and families sat huddled together, staring at the floor as if expecting their door to open, and their loved one to walk back in covered in coal dust. None came. The town was alive with grief, and yet beneath it all lay something stranger, an air of expectancy, as though the valley itself had not finished speaking. By the morning of the 19th, dozens had gathered once again at the mine's mouth. Some carried tools, shovels, picks, axes, intent on breaking past the barricade that had been erected the night before. Men and women alike stood ready, their eyes swollen from tears, their throats hoarse from shouting, but their will hardened by the thought of those still alive beneath the soil. For a brief moment, the crowd's determination was stronger than its despair. Mary Donnelly, whose husband Patrick was among the trapped, was the first to strike. She lifted her shovel high, slamming it into the timber across the shaft entrance. Splinters flying. Others followed, clawing, prying, hacking at the wood. And then it came, the sound that froze every hand mid-swing, a faint rhythm, deep within the earth, like the dull beat of a drum. 1, 2, 1, 2, then silence. Then again, 1, 2, 1, 2. Gasps erupted among the crowd. Someone shouted, "They're alive! They're alive down there!" Women fell to their knees sobbing. Men pressed their ears to the dirt, confirming it for themselves. It was not imagination, nor wishful thinking. It was the steady, desperate signal of men still breathing in the dark. But with hope came dread, for if they could be heard, why were they not being rescued? Why had Silas Ashford declared the mine too dangerous? And why did he order the barricade sealed again and again whenever families tried to tear it down? Later that morning, Ashford himself appeared, riding down from his mansion with 2 armed guards. His arrival silenced the crowd like a sudden frost. He dismounted, looked at the families gathered, and raised a hand for quiet. "I will say this once," he declared, his voice carrying with the practiced authority of a man used to command. "The collapse has made the lower shafts impassable. The gas that rises from such a fall will kill any who enter. You would be burying yourselves alongside the dead if you attempt to dig. They are not dead," Mary Donnelly screamed, pointing toward the ground. "You hear them same as we do." Her voice cracked but carried with fury. "They're alive, Silas. Alive, and you'd leave them to die." Murmurs rose in agreement, but Ashford's face remained cold, carved of stone. He motioned to his guards, who raised their rifles just enough to silence the crowd. He continued, "No man will endanger this town by opening that shaft. What lies beneath is sealed by God's own earth, and it will remain so." The words were final, delivered with a chilling calmness that suggested not fear, not concern, but intent. Ashford did not look like a man making a difficult decision for safety. He looked like a man enforcing an outcome he had already chosen long before the collapse. The families watched helplessly as his men reinforced the barricade, driving thick beams into place, hammering nails with brutal finality. Some tried to shout, some tried to beg, but no one dared move against the rifles. The tapping beneath the earth continued faintly as if mocking the futility above. Then as the last beam was nailed, the sound faded into silence. That night, the valley did not sleep. The air grew strangely heavy, a mist curling down from the ridge into the streets of Ashford. Families kept candles burning in their windows, unwilling to let darkness consume the last shred of hope. Some swore they heard voices carried on the wind, men's voices crying their names, begging for water, pleading for light. Others described dreams, so vivid, they felt more like memories, their husbands and sons crawling through endless tunnels, their fingers bloody and torn, their eyes wide with terror as the walls closed in. On the second night, the strangeness deepened. The Donnelly children woke screaming, insisting they had seen their father at the foot of their bed, his face gray, his lips moving though no sound emerged. Another woman claimed she opened her door to find muddy footprints leading across her porch, though no man stood there. The livestock too began to act strange. Horses refused to go near the stream. Dogs howled through the hours before dawn. Chickens scattered and refused to lay. It was as if the land itself carried the grief of those buried below. By the third day, families no longer whispered of accident or negligence. They spoke openly of betrayal. Men gathered in small groups, muttering of storming Ashford's mansion, demanding the shaft be opened. But each time voices rose toward action, fear followed. Silas Ashford's influence stretched far beyond the valley. He was connected to investors, politicians and men with power. If one rebelled openly, the whole family could be punished, evicted from their cabin, blacklisted from work, left with nothing. So they endured. They endured the silence of the mine that now loomed like a tombstone over the town. They endured the constant dread of the tapping that sometimes returned faintly, reminding them that life still lingered beneath the earth. They endured the coldness of Silas Ashford's gaze as he rode through town, ignoring the stares of the widows he himself had created. On the fourth night, a storm broke over Ashford.
Rain poured in torrents, flooding the dirt roads, striking against the barricaded shaft with the force of heaven's grief. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the valley in stark flashes, and in those moments of light, more than one villager swore they saw figures moving near the mine's mouth, men with hollow eyes and soot-covered faces, standing silently, their hands raised as if still begging to be pulled free. But when the thunder faded, and darkness returned, the figures were gone, leaving only the sound of rain on timber. The storm raged until morning, and with its passing came the stench. A foul, heavy odor seeped from the ground, acrid and choking, settling over the town like a shroud. The priest, Father Callahan, called it the smell of decay, but others whispered it was something worse, that the earth was not merely rotting what was inside, but rejecting it. Families begged him to bless the site, to pray for the souls of the men trapped below. He agreed, and on the morning of October 23rd, he stood before the barricade, censer swinging, smoke of incense curling into the air. His prayers were solemn, his Latin intonations echoing against the hillside, and yet as he spoke, the ground shivered beneath his feet. The censer trembled in his hand, and a low groan rose from the depths of the mine, so deep it rattled in the bones of all who heard it. Women screamed, men stepped back in terror. Father Callahan dropped the censer, his face pale as he whispered, "That is no prayer, answered by God." By the end of that week, hope was gone. The tapping had ceased entirely, the cries had vanished. Only silence remained, heavy and unbroken, pressing down on the town, like the soil that had buried 63 men alive.
Silas Ashford declared the matter closed, ordering an iron cross erected at the mine's mouth to mark it as a mass grave. But there were no bodies, no coffins, no funerals, only a barricade, a cross, and an emptiness that bled into every corner of Ashford, Virginia. The families carried on because they had no choice. Children still needed feeding, fires still needed tending, and debts to the company store still needed to be paid. Yet in every meal eaten, every prayer whispered, every door closed at night, there lingered the memory of October 18th, the day 63 men descended into the earth and never returned. A day that seemed less like tragedy and more like something chosen, deliberate, and terrible. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the town lay asleep and the mist crept back from the hills, some swore they could still hear it, faint, distant, steady, 1-2, 1-2, as if the men of Ashford still worked below, trapped in a shift that would never end. The weeks after the collapse were not measured in days, but in absences. Each morning, the valley awoke with the dull ache of loss, an emptiness carved into the rhythm of life. Men who once walked down the dirt streets on their way to the shaft were gone. Cabins that once glowed with lamplight now sat dark. Children, once noisy and restless, played more quietly, their games subdued by grief. The town of Ashford had been gutted in a single breath, and what remained was a hollowed-out shadow of what it had been. Ordinarily, when a mine disaster struck, as they had in other parts of Virginia or Pennsylvania, the aftermath followed a grim ritual. Rescue efforts, frantic at first, sometimes gave way to recovery operations. Bodies were dug from the rubble, coffins fashioned, funerals held. There was mourning, yes, but there was also closure. Men were laid in the earth by the hands of their kin, prayers spoken over graves, names carved into stone. That was the dignity afforded to the dead. But Ashford was different. There were no bodies, no coffins, no funerals. The barricade across the shaft stood untouched, guarded by Ashford's men, like soldiers at a border. Every attempt to breach it was met with threats, and once with the crack of warning shots fired into the air. The families begged, pleaded, wept before Silas Ashford himself, but his answer never changed. The mine is sealed, the men are gone, the matter is closed. It was this finality that ate away at the townsfolk more than anything else. The sense that their husbands and sons, their brothers and fathers had not been buried, not properly, that they had simply been erased. The iron cross, erected by Ashford, was meant to stand as a symbol of remembrance, but instead, it became a mockery. A single marker for 63 souls, nameless, faceless, claimed by earth and silence. Mothers spat at it when they passed. Widows refused to look at it. And children, curious and unafraid,
whispered that the cross was not a memorial at all, but a lock, a thing planted there to hold something beneath. The whispers began to spread in earnest. Some swore they still heard the tapping at night, faint but unmistakable. Others claimed to hear voices rising from the soil, not cries of help anymore, but murmurs, low and strange, as though the men below had learned a new language. The more time passed, the more impossible it seemed. How could they still be alive after we? And if they were not, then what voices haunted the night? Father Callahan tried to soothe his parish with words of faith. He spoke of eternal rest, of the souls of the dead freed from suffering, but even he could not silence the unease in his own eye. He had been there the day of the prayer, when the earth itself had groaned beneath his feet. He had felt the air turn foul, had heard the sound rise from below, a sound no scripture could explain. He never spoke of it again, but he never returned to the mine's mouth either. His sermons grew thinner, quieter, as though his own faith had been shaken. Then came the questions, louder each day. Why had the collapse happened at all? The miners knew the tunnels. They knew when timber was weak, when walls trembled, but no one had reported danger that morning. There had been no fire, no explosion, no rainstorm to loosen the soil. The collapse had come sudden and complete, swallowing every man in an instant. It felt less like an accident, and more like a closing door. Some claimed Ashford himself had ordered that the collapse had been engineered, perhaps by blasting charges placed in the wrong shaft, perhaps by the removal of crucial supports. Men who had worked the mines whispered of a new tunnel being dug deeper than any before, chasing a vein of coal that stretched into dangerous territory. They said Ashford had grown greedy, unwilling to slow production, willing to gamble with lives. And when the collapse came, sealing men inside, he saw not a tragedy, but an opportunity to bury the evidence. Insurance, that was the word that spread quietly, passed from one bitter mouth to another. Ashford had taken out policies on the mine itself, not on the men, but on the operation. With the mine collapsed and declared unworkable, he could claim the loss, collect the payout, and move on to another venture. To him, 63 men were not lives lost, but debts erased. The families tried to fight back. They wrote letters to Richmond, to Washington, to newspapers in towns larger than their own, but the responses came slow and hollow. The state deferred to Ashford's authority, citing his standing as a landowner and employer. The newspapers ran no stories, or if they did, the reports were short, clinical, burying the horror beneath statistics and dry facts. The name Ashford carried more weight than truth. Still, the families did not relent. They formed a committee, small but determined, to demand investigation. Meetings were held in secret, in back rooms lit by oil lamps, where men whispered of justice, while their wives wept quietly in the corners. But one by one, those who spoke too loudly began to vanish. A man named Thomas Riley, who had sworn he would testify about unsafe tunnels, was found drowned in the river, his pockets filled with stones. Another, Samuel Price, disappeared on his way home from the saloon, his body never found. Each disappearance left the town quieter, more afraid, until the meetings dwindled to nothing. And yet, the strangeness did not end. The ground near the mine grew soft, spongy, as if it were no longer solid earth, but something breathing. Children dared one another to press their ears to it, and some came away pale, claiming to have heard not just tapping, but singing, low, mournful voices weaving together in a dirge too human to dismiss, and too inhuman to endure. A widow, named Eliza Vaughn, swore she woke to the sound of her husband's voice outside her cabin, calling her name. She opened the door and saw only mist, but in the mud before her porch were footprints leading away toward the mine. She followed them until they vanished at the barricade, swallowed by the earth. By December, Ashford himself had grown restless. He stopped riding openly through town, retreating more often to his mansion on the hill. Some said he had nightmares, that his servants heard him shouting the names of the dead in his sleep. Others whispered that he had begun to walk at night, lantern in hand, wandering the ridge above the mine, muttering to himself as if keeping count. But no servant stayed long in his house, and those who left never spoke of what they had seen. The mine meanwhile remained closed, its entrance covered not only by timber, but now by earth carted in by Ashford's men. They worked for days, piling dirt, until the shaft was no longer visible, until the very mouth of the earth was erased. Families watched from a distance, horrified, powerless, as the last evidence of their loved one's resting place was sealed. There was no graveyard, no headstones, only a mound of dirt topped by a cross that seemed less like a memorial than a warning. And so the town of Ashford lived in the shadow of a wound that never closed. Every empty chair at a table, every silent porch at dusk, every child staring at the horizon, waiting for a father who would never come home, each was a reminder. But worse still was the sense that the men were not gone, not truly, that something held them still beneath the earth, restless, nameless, and unburied. And in the dead of winter nights, when the wind cut cold through the valley, there were those who swore they heard it again, the sound from below, not tapping this time, not voices, but something deeper, a shifting, like stone against stone, as if the earth itself was stirring, as if the collapse had not buried the miners, but awakened something older, something that now shared the darkness with them. By the turn of the new year, Ashford was a town haunted by what it did not have. It had no coffins, no funerals, no graves to weep over. The mine shaft, once the beating heart of the community, had been sealed so completely that even its outline was vanishing under the earth, carted in by Silas Ashford's men. To walk past the hill where the shaft had yawned was to see nothing more than a mound of dirt, barren and raw, topped with a single iron cross that stood as the only marker for 63 lives. Ordinarily, grief finds its outlet. A funeral brings tears that, however bitter, wash into some kind of acceptance. A grave allows a wife to kneel, a child to leave a flower, a community to speak the names of their dead aloud. But in Ashford, there was no such release. Instead, there was the suffocating sense of incompletion, of loss left unacknowledged, of names swallowed whole by silence. It was Mary Donnelly who gave voice to what so many already felt. She would stand before the cross at dusk, her children clinging to her skirts, and scream her husband's name over and over, as if by sheer force of will she could drag him back from the dark. Others joined her in time, wives, sisters, mothers, until the hill rang with cries that were not prayers but accusations. But no matter how loudly they shouted, the earth gave no answer, and so the bitterness turned outward. It turned toward Silas Ashford, who in the weeks after the collapse had grown more reclusive, yet more visible in the cruelty of his decision. He had forbidden any further attempts to dig, had threatened to evict families who trespassed near the barricade, had ordered his guards to patrol the mine site day and night, as if protecting treasure, rather than sealing a tomb. The iron cross, he said, was memorial enough, yet everyone knew it had been planted quickly, without ceremony, hammered into the dirt by one of his men, while Ashford himself watched from horseback. It bore no names, no dates, no inscription, beyond a crude engraving of a crucifix. The absence of names was the wound that cut deepest. In other towns, memorial stones bore the carved identities of the lost, keeping them alive in memory if not in flesh. But in Ashford, the 63 were nameless in death, their existence reduced to a single iron marker that said nothing, remembered nothing. To the widows it felt like erasure, like their husbands had never lived at all. And then came the discovery that made the silence more unbearable still. It was a boy who found it, the youngest son of a miner named Hugh Keene. Playing near the ridge, he stumbled across a trail of dirt wagons, half buried in fallen leaves and winter frost. Their wheels were still stained with soil, their axles rusting from disuse. Following the tracks, he saw where they had led, straight to the shaft, and straight away again. Not once, but many times, he ran home and told his mother, and she told the others. Soon the families gathered, following the boy's path, seeing for themselves the evidence of what they already suspected. The mine had not collapsed into itself. It had been Men whispered it first, then said it louder, then shouted it openly in fury. The earth piled over the shaft had not fallen by accident. It had been carted there deliberately, dumped load after load, until the shaft was buried beyond recognition. Ashford had not merely sealed the entrance, He had buried it, and with it he had buried the 63 men inside. The outrage that followed shook the town. Women stormed the company store demanding answers. Men gathered in the saloon, fists slamming against tables as they spoke of murder, of vengeance. But when they looked toward the hill where Ashford's mansion stood, their fury curdled into fear. Ashford's men were armed. His wealth gave him reach far beyond Ashford, and the law, if it came at all, would come in his favor. To defy him openly was to risk not only eviction, but disappearance. And so their rage found no outlet. It burned inward, feeding the sense of helplessness that already rotted their hearts. But grief, when denied, does not fade. It transforms, it warps, it seeps into dreams, into whispers, into the things people begin to see when their eyes are open in the dark. It began with the widows. They spoke of shadows in their cabins, moving where no light fell, of doors that creaked open at night, though the wind was still, of voices, faint, ragged, calling their names from outside, drawing them toward the mob. Mary Donnelly claimed she woke one night to find her husband's boots by the door, the same boots he had worn into the shaft, caked with fresh mud. She touched them, and they crumbled into dust.
Children, too, began to speak of their fathers returning. They described men with hollow eyes, and hands black with coal dust, standing at the foot of their beds. Some said the figures spoke, their words muffled, as if through earth, saying, "We're still down here. Dig, dig." The children's cries echoed through the night, waking neighbors who then swore they too had heard the voices. Even the animals were not untouched. Horses refused to graze near the ridge, their eyes rolling white whenever they were led close. Dogs whined and pulled at their chains, snarling at the empty darkness. Chickens scattered from their coops at dusk, clucking in wild terror, as though something unseen moved among them. The valley, once only heavy with grief, now seemed infected with a dread that grew sharper by the day. Father Callahan tried again to intervene. He organized a prayer vigil by the cross, gathering the families to sing hymns and light candles. For a time their voices rose strong, echoing against the hills. But as the final hymn ended, a wind swept down from the ridge, extinguishing every candle at once. In the sudden dark, several women swore they heard laughter, low, mocking, not human. The priest tried to dismiss it as imagination, but his hands trembled as he held his Bible, and he did not return to the site again. It was then that people began to whisper of something else, not of the men, but of what might have been beneath them. The older miners had spoken, before the collapse, of strange caverns deep in the earth, of tunnels that seemed not dug but formed, hollowed out long before men entered them. They had spoken of air that grew colder the deeper they went, of stones etched with patterns not of human hand. Silas Ashford had ignored their warnings, driving them deeper still, promising rich veins of coal if only they pressed on. But what if the mine had opened them not just a vein, but something older, something meant to stay sealed? The idea took root, watered by fear and silence. If the men were truly buried alive, why did no rescue come? Why did Ashford order the shaft filled rather than cleared? And why, in the nights that followed, did the widows hear voices that sounded not quite like their husbands, but like something speaking through them? By spring, the earth over the shaft had settled into a mound, bare of grass, lifeless as ash. The iron cross leaned slightly, rust eating its edges. Children avoided it in daylight, but at night they claimed to see figures standing there, tall, motionless, their faces hidden. Adults laughed nervously at the stories, but few dared go near after sunset. The hill was no longer just the site of a tragedy. It had become something else entirely, a place of dread, a place where the dead were not at rest. And through it all, Silas Ashford remained silent. He did not attend church, did not visit the town, did not acknowledge the families who glared at him with hollow eyes when he passed. His mansion on the hill stood lit at all hours, servants coming and going in haste, but the man himself seemed to shrink into shadow. Some swore he could be seen walking the ridge at night, lantern in hand, muttering names to himself. Others said he no longer slept at all, pacing endlessly, as if pursued by something only he could see. The The graves that should have been never were. The names that should have been carved in stone were lost, and the iron cross, the only marker of the 63, stood not as a tribute, but as a wound, a scar on the land. The missing graves became the town's obsession, their absence louder than any memorial could have been. For in Ashford, the dead had not been buried, they had been hidden, and what is hidden, in time does not stay silent. By late spring of 1883, Ashford was a place where sunlight could not banish shadows. Even at midday, when the fields glowed golden and children should have been running free, the air seemed heavy, like a breath held too long. The town still labored, wives stitched, men who hadn't gone into the mine worked the fields, or took odd jobs in neighboring towns. But everything was muted, as though the heartbeat of the valley had slowed. But when dusk fell, when the first traces of coal dust, darkness crept down the ridge, the real Ashford awoke, doors barred from the inside, windows shuttered, lamps extinguished earlier than ever before. Families whispered prayers not for salvation, but for endurance until morning. They had come to expect that every night would bring something: the knock on a door when no one stood outside, the sound of boots across the porch, the groan of wood as if a weight leaned against the house. At first people tried to explain these things away: the wind perhaps, the shifting of old wood, a raccoon on the roof. But explanations fell apart when too many people heard the same voice, or when objects moved where no animal could have moved them. And it was always the same pattern. The haunting began not in the town center, but in the homes of the widows. Take, for instance, the house of Mary Donnelly, who had been the first to cry her husband's name at the shaft. On the night of May 3rd, her children were roused from sleep by the sound of a shovel scraping against stone. They crept to the window, only to see their own father standing in the yard, his back bent, his hands bleeding, as he clawed at the ground. His face was pale, his lips cracked, and when he looked up at them, his eyes glowed faintly, as if lit from within. The children screamed, drawing Mary from her bed, but when she reached the yard, the figure was gone, leaving only claw marks in the dirt where no tool had touched. The Keenan household reported something worse. The eldest daughter swore she saw her father sitting at the table late one night, head bowed, muttering words she could not understand. His mouth moved too quickly, his jaw unhinged wider than it should, the voice spilling out like a dozen men speaking at once. When she screamed, the figure lifted its head, but its face was hollow, like a mask collapsing inward. The next morning, the kitchen chairs were overturned, and the family Bible lay torn in two on the floor. Stories spread like a fever. In the car home, every mirror cracked at the same moment one evening, splintering the reflections of the family into fragments. In the McBride cabin, a newborn wailed endlessly, until the mother swore she heard a man's voice humming a lullaby from beneath the floorboard. In the tavern, where men still gathered in the dark to drink their bitterness, mugs shattered in their hands when they began speaking of Silas Ashford by name, as if some unseen force sought to silence even their drunken talk. The voices were the worst of it. They came without warning, sometimes faint as a whisper against the ear, sometimes booming like a shout through the rafters. They spoke of digging, of air running out, of light fading. They accused the living of abandoning them, of allowing them to suffocate in the black. And sometimes the voices begged, "Bring us out, we are not gone, we are waiting." No one could sleep through such nights, and the exhaustion showed in the hollow faces of the townsfolk. Children cried constantly, women moved like specters through their own homes, and men grew short-tempered, fists clenching at the smallest slight. Some sought to leave, but Ashford was not a place easily escaped. The mining families had little money, and fewer connections. The valley was remote, and travel in groups drew attention from Ashford's guards, who still patrolled the land with rifles at their shoulders. Those who attempted to flee often returned, pale and shaken, speaking of strange obstacles on the roads, wagons breaking down without cause, horses refusing to move, eyes wide with terror, paths that seemed to twist back on themselves, so that travelers ended up right where they started, staring again at the ridge with its leaning iron cross. Even Father Callahan could not deny the change any longer. His sermons grew erratic, filled with fire and brimstone, as though the devil himself had come to roost in Ashford. But the families grew restless with his words. Prayer did not stop the voices, hymns did not still the shadows, candles burned out, holy water dried in the font. The church, once a sanctuary, felt no safer than the cabins, and late one night, Callahan himself confessed to the blacksmith that he had seen the miners in his dreams, eyes hollow, mouths moving silently, their hands reaching not for salvation, but for him. As spring bled into summer, the hauntings grew bolder. The apparitions no longer confined themselves to the widows' homes. They were seen on the streets, drifting between lampposts, standing motionless in alleyways. Men coming home late swore they passed friends they had lost, only to turn and find nothing there. Children played less and less outdoors, for every game was interrupted by the sight of coal-dusted hands rising from the soil. And yet, the strangest part was this. It was not only the dead that stalked the nights of Ashford. There were figures that none could name, shapes too tall, too thin, their outlines blurring at the edges as though they were not meant to be seen. Their presence carried a cold that seeped into the bones. When they passed, lamps dimmed, fires sputtered, breath fogged even in the warmth of summer. Unlike the miners, they never spoke. They only watched. Whispers returned to the old stories, the talk of caverns that predated the mine, of markings on stone, of things that stirred when men dug too deep. If the miners' spirits were truly among them, perhaps they were not alone. Perhaps something else had been buried below, and Ashford's greed had unleashed it. It was then that some began to look not at the iron cross on the hill, but at the man who had planted it, Silas Ashford. The town had begun to suspect what few dared say aloud, that the hauntings were not merely accidents of grief, nor random curses of the earth. They were deliberate, controlled, and Silas held the key. For though the apparitions tormented every family, no one reported such disturbances in Ashford's mansion. His estate stood untouched, its windows glowing with lamplight late into the night, but never dimming, never rattled by voices or footsteps. Servants, when pressed, said little, but one confessed in a trembling voice that Ashford kept a room in the cellar locked at all times. Strange chants could sometimes be heard from behind its door. The people wondered if the mine had not been closed to seal the dead, but to seal a bargain. Perhaps the men had not simply suffocated, but been offered. Their absence of graves, their namelessness, their erasure. What if that was not negligence, but necessity? What if Silas Ashford had needed them forgotten, their names erased, so that something else could claim them? The thought was more terrible than any haunting, because it suggested purpose, malice. A man who had chosen to bury 63 souls not out of cowardice, but out of pact. And still the hauntings grew. By July there was not a home untouched. Families slept in shifts, one keeping watch while the others tried to rest. Some began leaving offerings at the iron cross, food, tools, even locks of hair, hoping to appease the spirits. Others avoided it entirely, believing it no longer a memorial but an altar. The ground around it, barren since the collapse, began to change. The soil turned black and brittle, as if scorched from beneath. Small fissures opened between the rocks, exhaling air that smelled of rot and coal dust. One morning, townsfolk awoke to find something carved into the iron cross, not with tools but etched deep as though by claws. 3 words: "Let us out." No one claimed to have done it. No one dared go near the cross that night, and yet there it was. Letters gouged so deep they could not be scrubbed away. The message spread dread like wildfire. Were the miners truly begging for rescue, still alive somehow in a realm beyond? Or was something else using their voices, baiting the living to break the seal that Ashford had placed? In either case, the town knew this much. The haunting was no longer the mere echo of grief. It was a force, growing, feeding, demanding. The dead were not resting. The graves they had been denied were coming to life in another way entirely. And Ashford, watching from his mansion window, smiled faintly when he saw the town gathered at the hill. For if they broke the earth themselves, it would not be his sin, it would be theirs. By the end of that summer, the people of Ashford could no longer deny what their eyes, ears, and restless nights had been telling them. The heart of the curse was not buried in the mine alone. It radiated outward from the great house that loomed above the valley, where Silas Ashford lived in comfort while the town withered under nightly visitations. The signs were too many, too pointed. His mansion alone escaped the haunting. His servants, though haggard, reported no shattered glass, no voices,
no phantoms pacing their corridor, while children in town woke screaming from visions of their fathers clawing at the walls. Silas Ashford entertained guests from Richmond and Norfolk in his dining room, serving wine and venison beneath chandeliers that never flickered. The juxtaposition was unbearable. One evening, after another sleepless night when the whole of Main Street shook with knocking from doors that opened onto empty porches, the townsfolk gathered in the square. They spoke in hushed tones, faces drawn, but their voices carried a new sharpness, something beyond grief, beyond fear. Suspicion had hardened into certainty. "It is him," whispered John Keenan, fists trembling at his sides. "The mine, the cross, the names lost. He has bound them. I tell you, he has bound them for himself." Mary Donnelly, gaunt from weeks without proper rest, nodded with a grim determination. "My husband comes to me every night, but not as himself. He is held. His eyes plead, but his mouth speaks words that are not his. This is no haunting of chance. Silas holds their souls like cattle penned in the dark." The murmurs swelled, until even Father Callahan, who had long tried to frame the curse as God's test, bowed his head. He had confessed weeks earlier that the spirits whispered to him in the church, asking not for prayer but for relief. Now, even he could no longer shield Ashford. The decision was made in the way such things always are in desperate towns, not with ballots, nor proclamations, but with glances exchanged, nods shared, a silence that carried its own agreement. They would confront him. But Ashford was not a man easily approached. His mansion sat at the end of a long oak-lined drive, guarded by men with rifles who still answered his coin. The townsfolk had no weapons save their tools, shovels, hammers, kitchen knives, but anger gave them courage. They marched up the lane at dusk, more than 50 strong, carrying lanterns that bobbed like fireflies in the deepening gloom. The guards at the gate shifted uneasily, for though they were armed, they were few, and the crowd's determination was unmistakable. One guard raised his rifle, but when the people pressed forward as one, he faltered. The barrel dipped. Ashford's gold was heavy, but no coin could buy protection against a mob possessed by grief and terror. The gates creaked open, and the people streamed into the inside. Ashford awaited them. He stood at the top of the stairs in his grand hall, a tall figure draped in black, his silver hair catching the lamplight. His expression bore no fear. In fact, it carried a serenity that unsettled even the angriest among them. "So," he said, his voice calm, echoing across the high ceilings, "you have come at last." Mary Donnelly stepped forward, her voice raw from sleeplessness. "What have you done, Silas? What pact have you made? My children see their father in the yard, clawing at the earth. The dead will not rest. You must answer for this." Ashford's eyes flickered, but only for a moment. "Your husbands are not lost. They endure, better than if they had been left to rot beneath stone." "Endure," shouted Keenan, his face flushed with fury. "You mean they are chained? Their voices cry to us, begging for release. You sealed them in that shaft, and planted your cursed cross to mark their prison." A ripple of agreement surged through the crowd. People raised their lanterns higher, their shadows dancing across the wall. The mansion seemed smaller now, as though their anger pressed its walls inward. Ashford lifted a hand, not in defense but in proclamation. "You do not understand. The mine collapse was no accident. The earth was waking, and the men, your men, were already claimed. Their bodies perished, yes, but their souls." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "Their souls were spared from eternal oblivion. I have given them purpose." "Purpose," spat Callahan, his trembling voice rising with uncharacteristic rage. "You play priest to something unholy. Those voices are not salvation, they are torment. You have bartered with the pit." For the first time, Ashford's calm cracked. His jaw tightened, his voice deepened. "Better torment than silence, better chains than the void. I have preserved them, even if you lack the courage to see it. Without me, they would be nothing. With me, they endure." His words silenced the mob for a moment, not because they convinced, but because of the certainty with which he spoke. It was the conviction of a man who had indeed struck a bargain, who believed utterly in the necessity of his. Mary Donnelly raised her voice again, breaking the silence. "Then, release them. If you claim to have saved them, free them now. Let them rest." Ashford's eyes burned, rest. No, to undo the seal is to unleash what lies deep. They are tethered, not only to me, but to the thing beneath the stone. You think their cries are of me alone. No, they beg because they are tempted. The earth calls to them, and through them, to you. The words spread dread through the hall. For weeks the townsfolk had whispered of figures too tall, too thin, shapes that were not their loved ones. Now, Ashford gave those whispers form. What thing? Demanded Keenan, though his voice quavered. Ashford stepped down one stair, his shadow stretching across the polished floor. Before the mine, before Ashford itself, the ridge was not bare. It was marked, carvings older than any scripture, warnings perhaps or invitations. I do not know, but when we dug, we uncovered fissures, air that had never been breathed, and something stirred. The collapse was not stone giving way. It was hunger. 63 men fell that day, yes, but they did not fall into death alone. They fell into its grasp. To let them go now would be to break the seal entirely, and the hunger would not be sated with them alone. It would take us all. A heavy silence fell. The only sound was the hiss of oil lamps. The mob stood paralyzed between fury and fear. To kill Ashford now might undo whatever seal he had woven. To let him live was to continue enduring the hauntings. Either path led to ruin, but the choice was forced upon them. For as Ashford spoke his last words, the house itself groaned. The floorboards buckled, the chandeliers swayed though no wind stirred, and from the cellar, a sound rose low, guttural, not of this earth, a chorus of voices, 63 and more, overlapping in agony and hunger. The mob recoiled, some clutching their ears, others dropping lanterns that shattered, spilling oil across the floor. The flames licked at the edges of the hall, shadows jumping high, and through the smoke the people saw him, Silas Ashford, unmoved, standing tall, his arms outstretched as though in welcome. Do you see? He called over the din. They are with me still. They will always be with me. And now, they come for you. The cellar door splintered, and the chanting burst into the hall. Shapes spilled forth, half-formed bodies of coal dust and shadow, faces flickering between the familiar and the monstrous. Some bore the features of the lost miners, mouths opening in screams that never ceased. Others were taller, broader, stretched beyond human form, their limbs too long, their eyes pits of fire. The mob broke, fear scattered them, trampling one another in the rush to escape. Some fell, their screams swallowed by the shadows that surged forward. Others hurled themselves through windows, shards of glass cutting deep, but survival driving them onward. Ashford remained in the hall laughing, or perhaps weeping. It was hard to tell as the phantoms swirled around him. He was both master and servant, jailer and prisoner. And as the townsfolk fled into the night, the mansion behind them glowed with unnatural light, its windows blazing as though lit from within by a furnace. From the ridge, the iron cross stood black against the flames, and though the night was warm, the valley shivered as one. For now, Ashford still lived, but the town knew the true horror had only begun. And so the story of Ashford ends, not with answers, but with echoes. 63 voices buried beneath rock and time, their cries carried on the wind of a valley that never found peace. The men who entered that mine were fathers, sons, brothers. They went to work on an ordinary morning in 1882, and never came home. What the earth took that day, it never gave back. But what lingers in Ashford is more than tragedy. It is accused. Was Silas Ashford the true villain, binding the dead in a pact no man had the right to make? Or was he, in some dark twisted way, the only thing that kept something far older and far hungrier from rising out of the depths? No court, no coroner, no investigation ever gave an answer. The official records speak of a collapse, but the stories speak of chains, of bargains, of a hunger that waits. Generations have passed since that summer. The mine lies silent, the mansion burned, the iron cross rusted and broken. Yet travelers still whisper of shadows that move at the corner of the eye, of names whispered in the dark, of dreams where men claw at stone walls, crying out for release. The people of Ashford scattered, but the curse of Ashford never left. Perhaps that is the most unsettling part, not the collapse itself, not the missing graves, not even the belief that something monstrous dwells beneath the ridge, but the thought that 63 souls remain trapped in a half-life, neither gone nor free, their pain stretching across centuries, a punishment without crime, a grave without rest. And so we leave Ashford as we found it, haunted, unanswered, unresolved, a place where the line between man's greed and the earth's secrets was crossed, and 63 men paid the price. What do you believe? Was Silas Ashford a murderer who enslaved the dead, or the only man who understood the danger hidden in the ground? Were the miners victims of a curse, or the foundations of one? One thing is certain, the valley has never forgotten. And if you ever find yourself near the ridge on a moonless night, when the wind cuts through the trees, listen closely. You may hear them, 63 voices, still knocking, still calling, still waiting to be heard.